All right, everybody. I am Dave Rubin of the Rubin Report, and we're doing something special today. We've got a 3-hour stream for you that will be streaming right here on the Rubin Report YouTube channel, as well as the FreedomFest YouTube channel and at freedomfest.com. And I am joined by Mark Skousen. He is the founder of FreedomFest. And we're doing an emergency meeting here. We were supposed to do a live event in August. I was going to be there in Las Vegas. We were going to talk about all things freedom and libertarian and classical liberal and all that stuff that I'm always talking about on the show right here. And then obviously because of COVID, we were unable to do the live event. So we are doing a massive live stream today. We are bringing in, I don't know how many people, but it's probably a couple dozen people that we're going to have all sorts of conversations with on a wide range of topics. And of course, as you may have seen last night, there was a presidential debate, so I think we'll get to that as well. But let me first bring in Mark so you can find out a little bit about Freedom Fest and what he's been up to and sort of what we're going to do today. Mark, good morning.
Good morning, Dave. It's a real pleasure to be on the show with you. And I know you are going to be one of our keynote speakers at Freedom Fest in July in Las Vegas. And yes, the lockdown shut us down. It's nice to see you smiling, me smiling. I think Biden was the only one smiling last night. It seemed like Trump was really in a kind of a rough mood there, but we'll talk. We are going to talk about that. But that debate last night, that brawl, if you will, kind of reflects why we're having this emergency meeting. This is unprecedented, not only in terms of what happened, the anger, the fight over what's happening in this country is the reason why this is our second emergency meeting. It is via Zoom, and it is really important that we recognize that lots of things are unprecedented, not just the pandemic, but the runaway, easy money, aggressive monetary policy where the money supply is growing at 25%. We have government spending that is totally out of control. Nobody cares about the deficits anymore. They're trillions of dollars. We're talking about never-ending wars. There's lots of problems that we face, and it's affecting our way of life, our culture, and our portfolio. So there's a lot of reasons for us to have this emergency meeting. It's not to say we're not going to meet in person. In fact, next July, we are going to be meeting again at Freedom Fest, and we were hoping, Dave, that you will join us. It's going to be in person. We're absolutely determined to meet in person because that's what Freedom Fest is all about. That's what freedom is all about. So yes, this emergency meeting, we have totally new speakers that we haven't had before, including you as a host. And I did want to, it would be nice if you could just spend a minute. You've written a really interesting book to describe today's unusual environment. Don't burn this book. So maybe do you have a copy of the book you can show us and tell us a little bit about that?
There's a copy right over there over my, what is that? That's my right shoulder. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about the book, but I should also tell you that I am looking forward to next year's event in Vegas because believe it or not, I've only been to Vegas once and I stayed at Circus. So I don't know that I've done Vegas correctly. Okay. So I am overdue. I am overdue to get back to Vegas. Well, very quickly, I also want to talk about what exactly Freedom Fest is and why you started it. But quickly on my book and sort of why we're doing this on my channel, when we realized that the event wasn't going to happen this August, I immediately said to my guys, I was like, all right, well, let's talk to the Freedom Fest people and see if there's a way we can host a virtual event. Obviously, I'm more than happy to host it, and we're going to be bringing in a whole bunch of experts and thinkers and philosophers and authors over the next 3 hours. But as for my book, I mean, Don't Burn This Book really it's a defense of classical liberalism. And, you know, that is the set of ideas based on individual rights and logic and reason and limited government and laissez-faire economics that I believe are the right set of ideas to free the most amount of people and allow human beings to flourish in the best way possible. That's pretty in line with a lot of the stuff that FreedomFest and you guys talk about and that many of the guests we're going to bring on talk about. So I was really glad that, you know, the book did so well because, you know, we live in a time where if you watch the debates last night, it's not like you're hearing a lot about the right ideas. You hear politicians try to get each other, and then you hear moderators ask loaded questions, and everyone feels confused. I don't think there was anyone that watched that debate last night that walked away going, oh, I feel better about the country, or I feel better about our future, or I have a better understanding of the issues. So Don't Burn This Book really was, for me, it was sort of classical liberalism / libertarianism 101. And hopefully enough people will have read it that it will affect, you know, what happens in November. But before we move on to the next segment, I just want to let my audience find out a little bit more about you and why you started Freedom Fest. So can you help me out there?
I sure can, Dave. Thank you very much. And you brought up a lot of things in your book and about this debate last night that gives you an idea of what Freedom Fest is all about. So we're an intellectual feast in the entertainment capital of the world, which is very unusual. Oscar Goodman, the mayor of Las Vegas, said Freedom Fest is the most unique conference in Las Vegas. So we discuss philosophy, history, science and technology, geopolitics, investments, healthy living. We have the Anthem Film Festival that's put on every year. It's just we have several thousand people who gather who want a civil discussion about issues, and we focus on issues, we focus on history and philosophy rather than who is right. We want to focus on what is right. And all of our debates, and we're famous for our debates. We had a debate last year, for example, between John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods Market, and Kevin O'Leary of Shark Tank. And it was on the whole issue of what is the purpose of business? Is it to make a lot of money, or is it to fulfill a higher purpose? And it was a rock and roll debate, but it was extremely civil. Nobody talked over each other. We respected each other's views. And so people walk away from Freedom Fest and say, this is the most unique conference that I've ever been to, because we really do talk about ideas. We do try to persuade each other and not engage in the name calling. We try to avoid as much as possible. Oh, you are the radical left. You are the radical right. You're liberal. You're conservative. Let's talk about specific issues. Let's talk about individuals who hold those positions rather than these labels that demonize people and divide people. Freedom Fest, people gather together and they're from different political persuasions. We have investors who come who are not necessarily the classical liberals, but we get to discuss these issues. So that's just a little bit of a summary. Steve Forbes and John Mackey are our co-ambassadors. We've had we always have very unique individuals who come and speak. We've had William Shatner, we've had George Foreman, we've had George Will, Kevin O'Leary. Now, this last year, we were supposed to have Jordan Peterson. Maybe you can give us a little update on Jordan Peterson, because he was not able to come. You're a very good
unfortunately, as my audience knows, I spent a year and a half touring with Jordan. We did about 120 stops in roughly 20 countries. When I look back on that year and a half of my life, it almost seems like a dream. I mean, we talked to literally hundreds of thousands of people, and every single show was sold out, and it was absolutely incredible. As most people know, Jordan is dealing with some health stuff right now. I can't unfortunately say more than is sort of publicly known. Suffice to say, his next book will be coming out early next year, and I think we'll hear from him publicly around then. He's getting better, but yeah, I can't say much more. But what I can tell you is that the ideas that you just discussed there, and talking about the individual and freedom and purpose, which sounds like it was part of that debate that you guys hosted, those were the ideas that Jordan was putting forth. And what I love is when you can talk about sort of economic principles, but they're not disconnected from human principles of finding purpose and reason and things like that. So, man, I wish we were doing this in person, but you know, these wires of the internet will have to work for today.
Yes, indeed. Well, I look forward to it very much. And yes, being in person does make a difference. We can have our Zoom meeting and we can express some views, but there's nothing like the personal touch. And I think the debate last night was a perfect example of that, where they were not allowed to even shake hands. That's not going to happen at FreedomFest. We're going to shake hands. We may even do a brasso. Who knows?
I said to my agent when we signed the deal with you guys, it was obviously during COVID, and I said, I'm looking forward to getting out there and signing books and shaking hands with people. I don't remember the last time I shook someone's hand. All right. We got a couple hours for you guys. We got some really great speakers lined up. Some of the people I've talked to before and had on my show. There's going to be a whole bunch of people that we'll be introducing you to for the first time. And for those of you that are familiar with Freedom Fest, I think there's going to be a lot of familiar names. But first, we're going to throw to a commercial from the Atlas Society. Let's take a look.
But even if, in some fantasy world or parallel universe, socialism did produce, I would still oppose it, and you should still oppose it, because it is evil. And the reason it is evil is because it infringes upon the rights of the individual.
But of course, if we're interested in a politics of liberty, it's important for every individual to have the confidence and the competence in his or her, increasingly her own judgment, so that they can understand the way the world actually is in order to live successfully in it.
Ayn Rand is making a comeback, and the Atlas Society is making it happen.
All right, we're back. We are going to start off today with a half-hour segment talking about the pandemic. This is titled The Pandemic, Pandemonium. And Matt, I'm going to let you take it away. No, sorry, Mark, I'm going to let you take it away. I was throwing it to our guest before I threw it to my co-host.
Well, we have three guests with us, and and these are all experts who have had lots of experience with the pandemic or the COVID-19 or the Chinese flu that President Trump used the term at last night's debate. I want to start, well, let me first quickly introduce each one of our panelists. We have Lord Matt Ridley from the UK, who's a member of the House of Lords, and so he's coming to us all the way across the pond. And an author and a scientist, and has written extensively on the virus, the coronavirus that we faced and its impact. Then we have Johan Norberg from Sweden, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and an author as well. And his Free to Choose videos we absolutely love. That it's just great. What is it, like a 1 minute, couple of minutes, dispelling a lot of the myths that are out there. Love that. I think everybody would really enjoy that. And then Dr. Joel Mercola, who is one of the world's experts, medical and MD and expert on the COVID-19 and so forth. So we have a great group here. And so I'll ask questions and and Dave will ask questions, and let's have a really good session. So let me start with
Mark.
Matt.
Before we get to the first question, I just have to point out that let it never be said that FreedomFest guests are not well read, because there are roughly 1 billion books in that image right there. But these guys.
It's very, very true. They are authors, and don't forget us. We write books too. So Matt, let me ask you this question. Didn't you start off as a super alarmist, warning that millions of people were going to die based on the models that were created? What have you learned since then? Is it as bad as we expected? What have we learned, and have you gone from being an alarmist to a skeptic, or how do you put yourselves in this spectrum dealing with the lockdown and all that sort of thing? Give us your perspective historically, how you have changed your views over time.
Yeah, well, Mark, I'm a bit all over the place, like a lot of us on this. We're changing our minds as we go along. But 10 years ago, I wrote a book called The Rational Optimist, which I said the world's getting better, not worse. And I did say in that one of the things that might go wrong in this century is a pandemic. And I at one point said it might come from bats if we do, because of SARS and MERS and these other ones. But I got pretty reassured about our ability to get ahead of a virus because of genomic skills, because the bird flu, swine flu, SARS failed to mount a major challenge to the human race. And so I entered this year not expecting a serious problem from the Wuhan stories that were coming out. I didn't think it was going to spread to the West. Once it did, though, and I realized it had this very strange combination of being asymptomatic and very mild for a lot of people, but very dangerous for a few, I realized that this was actually a very dangerous combination, and it might be very hard to control it. And I think we've seen that is the case. We don't seem to be able to suppress it with non-pharmaceutical interventions, with lockdowns and things very effectively. We make a hash of that, but we can't get a vaccine ready. We've entered this year without enough innovation in vaccine development and things like that. So it has come along in a peculiarly well-designed way to exploit the vulnerabilities that we have at the moment. But as the time has gone on, I have become convinced that a lot of what we did in the early months was wrong. We effectively directed the virus into hospitals and care homes where it did the most damage. And we didn't allow herd immunity to build up in the general population. And I think we're going to hear from Johan how Sweden did something that was much more sustainable. And I think we all should be learning a lot from what the Swedes have done.
Well, maybe that's a good segue into Johan. Let's get Johan Norberg's views. Johan, you're in Stockholm right now, and can you tell us, there's been a lot of criticism of the Swedish model that it resulted in a high level of deaths compared to Norway and Denmark and Finland and so forth. But now it seems like the Swedish model is getting a lot of positive response, that maybe that was the right way to go. Can you give us your perspective on the Swedish model? You're an outlier. Why? How did you come up with this? It sounds like, is it Turgnell, the primary figure involved here? Does he deserve the Nobel Prize in chemistry?
Well, we'll see, I guess is the safest answer. Yes, Sweden is an outlier for the peculiar reason that Sweden stuck to the policy that most public health authorities actually agreed upon before we had a pandemic, when they were talking about how should we deal with a pandemic. But then after China started with a very radical and authoritarian shutdown, it seemed like there was not herd immunity, but a herd mentality, and every country just followed in their footsteps, even liberal democracies in the West. Sweden stuck to its guns, or well, the lack of guns, because there weren't many restrictions, few government restrictions. We stopped public events with more than 50 people, stopped visits to nursing homes. But apart from that, it was mostly a recommendation of social distancing, trying to trust Swedish citizens to uphold social distancing, don't go to work if you can avoid it, don't use public transportation if you can avoid it, don't meet, especially not elder relatives and so on, which meant that there was lots of social distancing in Sweden, even though it left some room for individual needs and local knowledge, which I think makes this more sustainable than a radical lockdown. Lots of people said that Sweden was engaging in a crazy experiment, but in fact, to us Swedes, it looked like the rest of the world was engaging in a crazy experiment, because the world has never shut down like it did during this pandemic. And well, the result in Sweden so far, I guess we have it from New York Times today with a big headline: vilified early over lax virus strategy, Sweden seems to have scourge controlled. Because the early models said that Sweden would by now have some 100,000 deaths from the coronavirus. They only had it wrong by around 94,000 people. The model said that 30 to 40 people would fight over every hospital bed. But in fact, we maintained an excess capacity in intensive care units by around 20% all this time. We built a big new field hospital in Stockholm with room for hundreds of COVID-19 patients. That was never taken into use because the normal healthcare system could deal with the cases, and it is now being dismantled. So it seems like at least the horror version of what would happen in Sweden, that never took place.
Johan, very quickly, and Dave, you can jump in on this too. Here in the United States, everything is all about the mask now. You have to wear the mask. The masks are very protective, and we want to get Dr. Mercola's views on the mask as well, because that seems to be the most public perspective, that if you're wearing a mask, you're protecting yourself. My understanding is hardly anybody wears a mask in Sweden. So do you guys not understand the science? What is your problem?
Well, no, there are no legal mandates. And in fact, from the Public Health Authority, they say that the science is not clear when it comes to masks, because if you use them in the wrong way, it might even make things worse. And it's also something that might tempt you to be too close to people and avoid social distancing if you wear masks. So it is not happening in Sweden. We have rarely used it historically, so it's not really the Swedish culture, and it's not at least the Public Health Authority's take on science here.
So I think that brings us, unless Dave, you want to make a comment?
Mark, why don't we get Dr. Mercola in here, and then I'll share some thoughts after that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. So Dr. Mercola, please come in, because I know you've been a skeptic from day one on this pandemic. You're an outlier in some respects. I think the majority of scientists do think the pandemic is very serious, as Matt Ridley was saying. You need to require the mask. You've got to have a vaccine and so forth. So give us your perspective. What have you learned over the last 6 months about this disease, and is there a cure?
Absolutely. Well, my take is life is a learning journey, and I have great respect for what Sweden did. And even though they initially started the pandemic with an increase in death rates, most experts now, from my understanding, attribute this to their failure to address the issue in the elderly population. And if they had done that, they would have been spectacular. But to this day, the results are confirmed that they resisted deploying the strategies recommended by virtually the entire world population, and my kudos to them. In the United States, even prior to this year, there has been a progressive suppression in censorship of information that addresses the truth. This is done primarily through Google, which controls 92% of the searches in the world, and all the social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter, Instagram. They are suppressing any information that directly contradicts the narrative of the World Health Organization. And many on this video understand that organization is largely funded, the largest funder outside of the United States, which Trump wisely refused to fund, is now Bill Gates. So anything that conflicts with what they say is seriously suppressed and censored. And largely as a result of many, certainly largely urban areas that are democratically controlled and implemented these strategies, are absolute miserable failures. So fortunately, we have some Republican governors. I live in the state of Florida. Governor DeSantis just earlier this week deployed a strategy very similar to Sweden. He stopped all the restrictions, no more social distancing, no more isolation, mask, and all the restaurants are open. So kudos to him, and I think we're going to, and we have not had an increase in cases. And there's this conflation of, once the deaths started going down, then because they're using fear to control the population. And so instead of using deaths, they switched it over to cases, making people believe that cases is a symptomatic infection when the true reality is not. Many of these tests are false positive. So what I've learned is that any information that conflicts with the narrative is suppressed. And one of the most important pieces of information is that we have the capacity to actually control this infection. In fact, the purpose of the vaccination program is to stimulate our own immune system, but very hardly anyone is discussing the simple strategies that we can do to activate our own immune system. And one of the ones that I've learned that is so important in this disease, and we've seen studies done specifically on vitamin D. There's one in Indonesia, and you can bring up the slide that shows that, where they had 212 patients, divided them into 4 equal groups, approximately equal groups. And the 2 most severe cases, the ones with severe and critical illness, 96% of that population with COVID-19 had low vitamin D levels. Where you go on the other side, and those with mild illness, 96% of that population had normal vitamin D levels. So that, you don't have to be a genius to understand that there's something to do with vitamin D. And the elderly and those with black skin are more susceptible to this because they're unable to literally go outside. And if they can go outside, they're not going to be able to get enough vitamin D. If you go to the next slide, understanding this, I put together a site that anyone can go to. It's called stopcovidcold.com. You don't have to submit an email or anything, and it can show you how to assess what your risk factor is for this disease. Simple 2-minute questionnaire, and it gives you the information, and there's reports that you can download that will supply you with easy to understand information that literally, because we don't have enough time to go into specific details there, but it's a simple strategy. And there are many others like insulin resistance and metabolic ill health or metabolic inflexibility, where our body, one of the common symptoms of that would be obesity. But what's common to obesity and diabetes and the other comorbidities like hypertension is that they are resistant to the hormone insulin. And when you are resistant to insulin, you have a massive overall suppression of your immune function. So just getting your immune function together and vitamin D levels will do enormous levels to improve your health and resist.
You mentioned obesity, and I think that's an important issue because we have an obesity epidemic here in the United States. But not in Europe. I mean, you go to the UK, you go to Sweden and so on, people are thin, right? They go to France, people are thin. Could that be, Johan is shaking his head. He's not, UK, I don't know. Maybe I misinterpreted that issue, but people who have comorbidity, this is an issue as to why they're suffering. Why don't we focus on healthy living rather than, we have everyone sequestered at home. The people are gaining weight. They're getting depressed. Maybe we have the wrong formula. Dave, you probably need make some comments or ask some questions.
Yeah, well, look, I'm out here in SoCal where everybody looks great and there's plenty of sunshine, so they're getting vitamin D and everyone looks healthy, and yet we're all walking around in masks all day. But Dr. Mercola actually hit on two things that I thought was interesting there. One, this is just anecdotal, but I have a friend whose girlfriend is a nurse here in California, and she said that at the hospital she's at, when you talk about the case numbers, that actually if someone comes in with COVID, they recount that case as COVID every day that they're at the hospital. So if you come in on day one and they diagnose you with COVID, that counts as one case. If you're there for 5 days, you're recounted as a new case every day. So that shows you that the numbers are a little screwy. And then what you mentioned sort of about
make a comment on that.
All right, let me just say one other thing, and then we'll throw it to Johan, because this is related to the numbers as well, which is that when we talk about, well, trusting the CDC or trusting the WHO or the rest of it, you know, this brings us to something that's very dear to me, and I think for probably most of the people watching this, which is just also how much power big tech has over us, and, you know, what information can be shared and is considered to be trusted and what isn't. But Johan, let's throw it to you.
Yeah, this is an incredibly important reason why we should be a little bit cautious about trying to compare cases and deaths around the world, because we don't have a standardized definition. For example, in Sweden, if you have or likely had COVID-19 and then you die within a 30-day period, you are counted as a COVID-19 death, even though you might have died from cancer or a heart attack or even run over by a truck. Whereas, so you count those who die with COVID-19 rather than those who died of COVID-19. Whereas in, for example, a very culturally and geographically similar country like Norway, they have great statistics, but they only count something as a COVID-19 death if a doctor looks at this person and concludes that COVID-19 killed him. And then he reports this to the authorities as a COVID-19 death. So I think we should wait a long time and look at excess deaths generally in countries before we begin to conclude who had a success or a fiasco over here.
Matt, you had a comment.
Yeah, I particularly just wanted to say one more thing about Sweden, which I think will interest Johan, which is that the British media has gone from saying out loud and very hysterically, Sweden is heading for a catastrophe, there's going to be millions dead in the streets and so on, to saying, no, the reason Sweden is doing better than us is because it's a different country. Their system wouldn't work here. They all live in huts in the forest, blah, 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 you know, etc. This is ridiculous. Sweden is a more urbanized country than the UK is, actually, and its total population density is roughly the same as Scotland's, which has a bad epidemic. So the idea, you know, the way the media has pivoted from saying Sweden's not going to work to saying Sweden has worked, but it's a special case so we can ignore it is really, really quite striking. Just on the point that you were just making, Johan, about deaths and deaths from other causes, there is good evidence now, certainly in the UK, that there is a pretty bad epidemic of mental illness coming about as a result of this problem. And it's worse among the young people than the old. Well, this is the very group that is not suffering very badly from the COVID virus. It's not being caused by the virus, it's being caused by the lockdown. So it is very probable that in terms of suicides and other things, that we will have a terrible epidemic among young people of increased problems that will dwarf anything that the virus does. So we do have to find a way to keep old people safe from this virus, because it isn't a safe virus for older people with comorbidities. And at the same time, allow normal life to resume for younger people, because it's a catastrophe what we're doing to our economy. I believe Sweden is still running a surplus. We're not. We're running a £300 billion deficit this year.
Wow. Wow. Yeah,
let's throw it to Dr. Mercola.
Yeah, just to highlight that point, less than 2 weeks ago, the CDC in the United States admitted that only 6% of the deaths from, and that's an important preposition, from, because that's what the media uses. They said died, 200,000 people just died from. No, 200,000 people died with COVID-19. The CDC acknowledges that only 6% of those died from it. So 94% did not die from the virus. They died from these confounding comorbidities. admitted by the CDC.
Right. So that's about 12,000 people.
How long is this lockdown going to continue? It sounds like from your own perspective, it's a mistake to engage in this lockdown. I understand that it's gotten worse in the UK in terms of the lockdown. So when are we going to be able to have FreedomFest and have the doors opened and are we going to be even physically able to gather together a couple thousand people in Las Vegas next July? Or if it's in the UK, we could all move to Sweden. We could have FreedomFest in Stockholm and we'd be fine, right?
Good idea. Good idea. I mean, here in the northeast of England, we're under a renewed lockdown. We're now not allowed to socialize in each other's homes at all. And we're not allowed to meet in the pub with people from other households. If we do go to the pub all on our own, we have to be out by 10 o'clock. And all of these laws are going through. We had a big debate in Parliament about this at the beginning of the week. They're going through based on an act that was passed 6 months ago that enabled the government to do anything it likes, basically to lock people up and not to have to come back to Parliament to get permission to bring in these new rules and laws. And, you know, we had a protest vote against that in the House of Lords saying, come on, you've got to come back to Parliament and get approval to do these illiberal things that we're doing to our society, because it isn't working very well. It's very dangerous from the point of view of the economics, and it's terrifying what it's doing to society and to the desire for people to control each other's lives. Yeah. What really worries me is that once government gets hold of these kind of powers, it doesn't like to give them up too easily.
Yeah, well, I see we all nodded our head in agreement on that one, because that really gets to the heart of the reason why FreedomFest exists and why we care about these ideas. That's totally where I'm worried about. Look, I'm not a scientist, so I can track the information and listen to experts like you guys. But that part, the idea that, I can't make a decision as an adult over who is going to enter my home. Now, I'm in Los Angeles. We've got a pretty intense lockdown. You are allowed to have people in your home. It sounds like it is worse, at least at the moment, in terms of regulation in the UK. But the fact that we've allowed the government to say these are powers that we have over you, that's where you get all of my bells as somebody that cares about personal freedom. You get all those bells going.
And Dave, I would also add that in the United States, we have a written constitution, and in it, the Bill of Rights clearly says that Congress can make no law to abridge the freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and notice all of those have been abridged, just carte blanche, and our church leaders, our religious leaders, our local leaders, our universities, we've all just laid down and said, we won't go to church. We won't go to university. We won't go we'll do everything online. Unfortunately, technology has hurt us in this respect, because let's face it, you wouldn't have closed down the schools. You wouldn't have closed down the churches. You wouldn't have done any of this, except now we can do everything online. We can do the Zoom meeting. Zoom stock has gone through the roof. So Wall Street people are delighted with what's happening, and yet something is missing. It's called privileges, rights, freedom, liberty. Those have all been abridged. And, what do you do in countries, you're in Sweden. Do you have rights? Do you have privileges? Apparently you do.
Yeah, we didn't throw them overboard the moment we were in a crisis. But unfortunately, this fits with a historical pattern. H.L. Mencken's old saying, the goal of the demagogue is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous for safety. And I actually just published this book, Open, the Story of Human Progress, and it's got a very nice endorsement from Matt Ridley, so it must be good. And there I point to all the crises in history, depressions, the pandemics, the natural disasters, what have you. It always creates this kind of societal fight or flight instinct when we want to be protected by the big man, the big government. And there are two major problems with this. The first one is that you never think of the alternative cost, because yes, this might be the way. A shutdown might at least delay many of the cases and deaths, but it doesn't take into the calculation all the things that should have happened and don't now. People don't go to hospital. They don't go to cancer screening. We don't get vaccinations around the world. In poor countries, we will see probably an increase in extreme poverty by somewhere around 100 to 300 million people. Another 100 million people thrown into chronic undernourishment because of lack of transportation, trade, production, the things that we need. That's also a dramatic cost. The other thing is that once governments assume powers like this, it rarely gives them back, at least not in its entirety. There's a ratchet effect. They keep much of it. And what worries me is that historically speaking, this has been very bad. Lots of cases and deaths, and it's terrible, shouldn't be made light of. But historically speaking, it was a relatively mild pandemic. We'll get worse pandemics in the future. We'll see worse crises in other forms in the future as well. If we're so willing to throw all our liberties overboard once we get this, what are we willing to do the next time around?
Johan, show us your book again. What's it called? Open. And it's a very
the story of human progress.
It kind of surprises me that your book is so thick, because I think that this should be one of those thin books in history. And so your sequel would probably be called Closed, and that'll be a very thick book, even thicker than that one. I really hope that that book, Open, we get back to that, because I'm sure your book was written before the pandemic began, right?
Actually, the second half of the book is called Closed, about all the closures historically, including in times of pandemics. And I even managed to include some of the updates.
One of the weird things...
Matt, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, one of the things that I've noticed in this country, and I don't know if it's true elsewhere, is that the people on public salaries are quite happy to remain locked down, because they can stay at home and draw their full salaries. And they don't see what the problem is. In fact, they're quite enjoying it to some extent. And there's a real double standard here, that people in the private sector are really worried about their jobs. Government is trying to help them, but not for long, and there are job losses occurring on a massive scale. Whereas civil servants, officials in central government are saying, well, no, we'll just stay at home and do the odd Zoom meeting and take the dog for a walk. That really worries me, is that the difference between the way you're treated if you're in one sector versus another.
I feel that very intimately here in Los Angeles, because, we've got a progressive big government governor in Gavin Newsom, who was the former mayor of San Francisco, and we know that it didn't quite work out there. And then we've got a progressive mayor here in Eric Garcetti. And then, of course, we've also got Nancy Pelosi, from California, and she's having ice cream and getting her hair cut. And, I can walk to several restaurants that, are within a mile of my house, and they're all closed, and they're small businesses, or the best they can do is put 2 or 4 tables outside. And of course, that's not sustainable. And you'd think that if these people are true public servants, that they would be out there every single day explaining why we have to, in effect, ruin your livelihoods. And yet they don't. It's just that every few weeks, they just give us a new edict of how we have to behave.
Well, it looks like we've run out of time, but I would like to have Dr. Mercola talk, end this by saying, well, what about medical scientists? We started with Neil Ferguson in the UK, Dr. Fauci in the US. Both of them still seem to be alarmists. Nothing has changed. They want the lockdown to continue indefinitely. What is in the self-interest of the medical profession to want to solve this problem right away? I mean, they are pro-vaccine, but it does seem like it's taking forever for this vaccine. And I'm not sure the vaccine solves the problem. Solves the symptoms maybe, but not the problem.
Well, vaccine in no way is going to solve the problem, because Normally, it takes about 9 years or so to put it through the rigorous trials to exclude any side effects, and this one is going to, at a fraction of that time. So it's inevitable to be a disaster, just like the swine flu vaccine in 1977 that preceded this, which literally had to be stopped after it was encouraged by the government, and $3 billion was awarded. But what most physicians, if they're going into health care to help people, their true desire is to literally support them. Unfortunately, they're no different than anyone else, and they've been brainwashed, manipulated. The whole narrative in medical school, and I know because I went, is directed at literally suppressing these types of natural therapies that have been used for ages. That anything that conflicts with the pharmaceutical paradigm is suppressed. So, and that was done in 1910 by the Carnegie report that literally kicked out these natural therapies like homeopathy and other strategies. So it's difficult for them to get anything other than the main narrative, and they're so busy taking care of their patients and other things, they don't have time to explore these details in the amount of time they need to gain the understanding and proper perspective and the wisdom. So, but ultimately we want to preserve that. And interestingly, Dr. Fauci had mentioned reluctantly capitulated that even he takes vitamin D. So again, that stopcovidcold.com gives you all the information. It's free. There's no email sign to stopcovidcold.com. So you can get these more information of what you can do to protect yourself, your families, and your loved one from this illness.
Great. Well, we want to thank you guys for joining us, and we are going to throw to a commercial from the Capital Research Center.
COVID-19 has drastically changed the lives of millions of American children. Though children are substantially less likely to be harmed by a COVID infection, schools across the nation have shut down over the pandemic, and keeping kids at home doesn't just affect them, but entire families. 56% of parents are concerned about missing work if their child's school is closed, and 43% are concerned about making up for the free or reduced price meals that their child received at school. Despite the difficulties families experienced in the spring, it looks like schools across the nation will remain closed or in limited capacity in the fall, despite the American Academy of Pediatrics strongly advocating that all policy considerations for the coming school year should start with the goal of having students physically present in school. Unfortunately, the teachers' unions are forcing schools to stay closed. That's power they shouldn't have.
All right, our next half-hour discussion is on the question, is America on the brink of political and economic collapse? Normally, I would think that would be a bit of an alarmist question, but I'm actually not sure after watching the debate last night. We've got a couple of great guests here, but I have to handle the intro for the first guy myself. The man I've dubbed the Willy Wonka of politics, Michael Malice. Is America crumbling? You're one of the only guys I trust.
Absolutely, and it's absolutely glorious. And I think far more than the debate, what brought about the Civil War and American self-segregation at that time was the Dred Scott decision. Before Dred Scott, you had the idea that the South was slave, the North was free, and they basically had a gentleman's agreement. Each side doesn't bother each other. Dred Scott's master takes him from slave soil Missouri to free soil Illinois. He sues to get his freedom. And the Supreme Court finds, no, even if you're a slave on free soil, you are still a slave, which means slavery is everywhere in America. And this was a huge problem for the North. This is regarded historically as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions of all time. And after that, it was a series of dominoes. We are at a point for the first time since the Civil War, in my view, where the Supreme Court's legitimacy is about to be regarded as illegitimate, where there is not a consensus that, like, you know what, maybe we're going to lose this one, but, you know, in the main, it's a good idea to have a Supreme Court. It's becoming so politicized by both sides that this is going to, in my view, hopefully lead the way towards a systemic American separation.
Malice, not only do I love you because of your brilliant political insight, but also because you keep a picture of yourself behind you.
That's me on your show. That's a painting. From Tho Bishop from the Mises Institute with the red pills.
Very nice, very nice. Mark, who do you want to introduce next?
Okay, so we have Ramesh Ponnuru, right? Did I say that correctly? And
you did.
You're with National Review, and of course, I knew Bill Buckley personally for many years, a good friend of mine. You're with National Review. National Review is officially anti-Trump, correct?
No, we were against Trump during the 2016 primaries. We've got a range of views on our editorial staff. One of the last places where you can still find people just arguing things out inside one publication.
Well, that's good to hear for sure. Now, we also have Kevin Hassett, who is the former chairman of the economic advisors to President Trump. So we assume you are pro-Trump even after leaving office. But now that you've left office and you are you with AEI, or let's see, I'm trying.
Yeah, I used to be at AEI, but now I'm at Hoover.
Oh, that's right, with Hoover. Are you in California right now? Is that the background? It looks like.
No, I'm actually a little depressed because I'm stuck in DC and I was supposed to be out there this semester, and so I remind myself of where I should be with my virtual background.
Yes, indeed. And
background.
Then we have Matt Welch, and he's the editor at large. I love that. That's kind of like the term diplomat or something. It sounds like you can, like the Hoover Institution, you're paid to think. Is that an accurate way of describing you?
I just wish that I had the immunity to come with it and can run through all the traffic light cameras here in Brooklyn. But yes, editor at large is the best way to describe me for Reason Magazine.
Well, so that covers all four of our characters. I would like to start with Kevin Hassett because as an economist, I don't know if you watched the debate last night or not, if you could handle the hour and a half brawl. Boy, how do you deal with a president that is constantly agitating, and is he aggressive like that in person? And what's your perspective on this? I mean, all the election betting odds say that Biden won this debate overwhelmingly. How do you see it?
Right. Well, I think that the election markets presumably were thinking that there was a chance that Joe Biden would have a complete meltdown, and he absolutely did not do that. And, I think that if you look at the substance, for me, the headline of the debate was that there were a lot of things that Biden refused to do to separate himself from things that I think moderate voters are afraid of. And so, like the Green New Deal is a terrifying policy that would really destroy the country. And, he's willing to pack the court. He's willing to kill the filibuster. And I think that that's like the substantive news from last night. But I know that it's hard to focus on the substantive news given all the fireworks.
Yes, indeed. I'd be curious what Matt and Ramesh, what you thought of the debate. Could you handle it emotionally, survive, or will you ever watch another debate after this one? Is it even worth your time?
Alcohol is a marvelous, marvelous drug, Mark, as we all know. Yeah, I have to watch it for a living. I wouldn't otherwise at all. It was viscerally unpleasant television and arguably exactly what we deserve as a country. I think it's an accurate reflection of how lousy and stupid our politics are and will be probably for a generation. I'm not a catastrophist, cheerfully or otherwise, like my friend Michael Malice, for whom I always disagree with very, very cautiously, because he's probably right and I'm probably wrong. But I think it's more, as Johnny Rotten, that great MAGA hat wearer, once sang about the UK, we're just another country. I think that's what we have been seeing over the last, especially 5 years, and what we will probably see for the next 15, is that American exceptionalism, for good and for bad, and it's been both, we're doing the same stuff that Hungary is doing. God help us. We're doing the same stuff that a hell of a lot of countries are doing right now. We're getting into this kind of crabby populism Right now, the governing crabby populism is of the right. We will at some point soon get crabby populism of the left, and it will be bad at every level of government. I live in New York City. My God, we are governed by boobs and incompetence here. It is amazing to behold. I don't see any sanctuary of good governance in this country, and I don't see any promise of a sanctuary of good governance for this country. The people who are trying to backfill and create some kind of ideological wish casting on Trumpism and hope to replace him, the Tom Cottons of the world, the Josh Hawleys of the world, they are, from my point of view, and Ramesh will probably disagree, nightmares too. And I don't see anything really good happening from it. The best thing we could say about Joe Biden, which really we can't say any really good thing about Joe Biden, is that he's a rusty weather vane, right? Like he creaks slowly in the direction of the prevailing winds. So at least he won't go fast into the Green New Deal, but that's about it.
Matt, I know that, Dave, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I want to get to Ramesh on that because I think it's an interesting question, what you brought up right there, which is sort of that Biden is like the bulwark, the sort of rusty bulwark against the radical leftism, and how quickly will that break? And I think a lot of people thought, oh, he's going to get on stage last night and just melt down, and then it'll show that they're about, that the radical leftists are here. That didn't quite happen. But your second point on, these guys behind Trump, is there sort of an intellectual backing behind Trump? I'm kind of hopeful for that. Ramesh, what do you think?
Well, first of all, let me say my hat's off to Kevin Hassett, who has found a virtual background that is a perfect match for his personality. I asked the question about whether I'll watch another debate again. Yes, but not with children present. I would like to see better examples set for them. I think what I saw last night was not the picture of the political leadership of a country that is about to undergo collapse, but one that is undergoing decay. And you can see that partly in the kind of gerontocracy that we saw on display. And you can see it as well, I think, in the way both parties have been running away at maybe different speeds from free markets, limited government, the rule of law, and other such principles that have made our country great. In Joe Biden's case, he has always been somebody who goes where the mainstream of the Democratic Party is. He doesn't lead it, he follows it, and that mainstream of the Democratic Party has been moving left. The online left overestimated just how far left it was during the primaries and backed a bunch of left-wing candidates who had the same misunderstanding. But if you remove the sort of distortion field of Twitter, then I think you have to objectively look at Biden's platform and say it is the most left-wing, progressive, and statist that we've seen from any Democrat for quite a long time. And I think you can see also that Biden's having a little trouble navigating these currents. You could see it in the space of a couple minutes last night when he said, "I don't support the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal will pay for itself by creating thousands of jobs. I don't support the Green New Deal." That was one of the closest things he had last night to a senior moment. But then, which, by the way, according to his own website, he does support the Green New Deal. That's right. That's right. He, his own, JoeBiden.com says, the Green New Deal is the right framework. But when you look at Trump, you don't see somebody who is, let's say an evangelist for free markets, and whose instincts on trade, instincts on drug prices are not always aligned with free markets, not always, in my view, based in reality. And so I think that those of us who do think that there's a lot to be said for free markets and a lot more opportunities for America to seize using them, we really have our work cut out for us.
I'd like to mention a couple of things that Joe Biden said that I thought Trump could have responded to if he was truly a free market one. And that is when Joe Biden said, Donald Trump does not have a plan when it comes to health care. And of course, we're laissez-faire. We're not sure we should have a plan per se. But, he could have said, Kevin, health savings accounts. He could have referred to Singapore's MediSave program that has been highly successful. There's lots of examples. Perhaps even other countries may have medical systems that work better. Were you disappointed, Kevin, when Donald Trump never responded to having a plan for healthcare, which is a major issue among voters?
Right. You know, I think that there were a number of points where he could have said something about what he's done and his accomplishments, and even to be a little responsive to what Ramesh said. Like, because of free markets and competition being brought into healthcare through myriad regulatory changes that we made while I was still over there, we did things, for example, like accept a gazillion generic drugs, which made it so the consumer price index for drugs in the U.S. declined 2 years in a row, and each of those declines were the first decline since World War II. And it was because there was so much more competition in healthcare markets. And so I think that that's an example of, well, of course I have a plan, but my plan is to make it cheaper. He did say that, but he could have given a better example. But there were a lot of cases like that. And I just want to give you an example that you might remember that, like, when we were selling the tax cuts, I was on TV all the time. The president was on TV all the time promising that they deliver $4,000 in wages, because if you have more jobs, you have a higher demand for labor and it drives up wages. And it would do that in 3 to 5 years. Well, in 2019 alone, we got the data last week, then wages went up by $4,300 just in that year alone for the median family. And in the 8 years of Biden and Obama, the median wage only went up by $1,300 for the whole 8 years. Last year alone, it tripled the whole 8 years of Biden and Obama. So the point is, if I were debating, I would have been laying all over the points like that. And I think that he didn't do that. He made a tactical decision, basically, I think, to litigate stuff that the mainstream media's refused to litigate. Like bringing up the director of national intelligence released yesterday some documents that showed that the Obama administration was warned that Hillary Clinton was planned to set Trump up with a fake Russia hoax, right? And things like that. Like, so all of that stuff and the Hunter Biden stuff is something that you just don't hear about at all in the mainstream media. And I guess he decided he had to litigate all that stuff because it was the way to get the message through.
So Malice, as I was watching this last night, I kept thinking, I'm looking through Twitter and I'm looking at everybody saying this is depressing, this is awful. There were very few people, even the pure partisans weren't saying, oh, my guy absolutely won. I mean, everybody was saying this thing was a disaster and Chris Wallace was terrible and the whole thing. Of course, you get some of the partisans, but for the most part, that was the general takeaway. And I kept thinking, I'm looking forward to talking to Malice tomorrow, because if someone's enjoying this, it's got to be Michael Malice, because this is sort of what you want to happen, I think. Can you explain exactly why that is?
Sure. It's those who need leaders are not qualified to choose them. So if you're sitting there as a voter and you don't know anything about politics, and these are the two choices you have, if you don't even speak English, if you're looking at how these men are carrying themselves, their posture, their body language, they're both, not acceptable as someone who's going to make decisions over whether my wife has a kid, going to war, and all these other things, simply due to their body language. I think they were both debating in very different ways. One of the things that Joe Biden represents very well, the American argument for having democracy over aristocracy was, after a while, the aristocrats kind of inbreed, and you get something like the Habsburg jaw, where you have this kind of low-hanging jaw and the people can't even talk. And there's no better example of this than Joe Biden, who was 1 second away from literally voiding his bowels at all times. On the other hand, you have President Trump, who's just like barking like an attack dog. And they should have called him Jeb Biden, because there was and I think at one point he did call him Jeb. The body language and the aggression was completely off the charts. And if you're looking at it from one of these kind of sociological aspects, it is that kind of is a very, very old school business approach, like the proverbial Trump handshake, where he grabs people, pulls them, where you have one guy owning the room and kind of putting his on the desk and showing them who's boss. Now, that might work on Wall Street, but in this context where there's soccer moms, I don't think it played necessarily well for him. But there sure were a lot of good sound bites at Joe Biden's expense, and he wouldn't even make eye contact with Trump, which just shows you how when a man is weak.
Yeah.
Well,
did you guys sense that? Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say, Dave, and Michael, speaking of body language, Biden did a good job of pandering, in a sense. He looked right at the camera. He smiled. In large measure, he was polite. There were some exceptions, but Trump clearly was the aggressor and constantly interrupting. He embarrassed himself. I was embarrassed. I think a lot of people were embarrassed by that. What do you think of the fact that Biden smiled, looked into the camera? It seems like that's the way politicians should act. What is the problem with Trump? He couldn't even smile the entire time. He had a grumpy look on his face the entire hour and a half.
Malice, can I let me give it 20 seconds and then I want you to answer this. So my take on the Biden smile is that it's very inauthentic, actually. It's whenever Trump made what I thought was a pretty decent point, Biden just smiled it off, which is something Hillary would do. You just laugh it off as if it has no meaning. So when Trump brought up, Hunter and the 3.5 million, Biden's laughing as if it has no meaning, as opposed to addressing it, which we know it's an actual issue. But I think just one other thing on this, which is that Trump coming in so angry and so indignant, it sort of works when you're not president, but when you are president, it hit me in the middle of it. I was actually expecting him to act a little more presidential last night, which I very rarely ask him to do. Malice, what do you think?
If you go back and look at Ayn Rand, the great vampire novelist, on Donahue in 1980, her second appearance, she discusses this exact thing vis-a-vis Jimmy Carter. She says, if you watch, I'm not going to do her accent here. If you watch Jimmy Carter, he smiles even when things are supposed to be serious. It's like a nervous tick. And she makes the face. She goes, oh, gosh, I forgot him on TV. So I think it's a very corporate thing to do when someone is saying things that are very scurrilous about you. This happened with Tulsi and Kamala Harris. Tulsi's like, look, there was a guy in death row. You had his DNA. You didn't want to be released. And she's like, oh, it's like, okay, why are you laughing even if Tulsi's full of crap? Why? This isn't funny. This is something very serious you're being accused of. And to signal that this is something to be serious is effective with some members of the audience. But in terms of people who have some understanding of politics and the facts, it's kind of disquieting.
So if I could jump in on this, just two things that struck me as different between Trump in 2016 and Trump now. Trump often in 2016 seemed to be enjoying himself on the campaign trail. And I don't think he felt, you didn't get that last night. You get the sense that he enjoyed being an insurgent challenger in a way he doesn't enjoy running as an incumbent. The second thing is in 2016, he talked about a lot of issues that mattered to a lot of voters, but weren't being discussed by political elites, immigration being one, manufacturing jobs, the opioid crisis. I feel like he's spending a lot less time talking about those sorts of issues. He didn't bring up immigration once. The media's not going to do it for him if he doesn't do it himself. And he talked about a bunch of stuff that is more of interest to him than it is to large groups of voters. And frankly, I think the Hunter Biden thing is an example of that, because it's the sort of thing people who are totally revved up in his corner know about this issue. If they're not in his corner already, he's got to explain what it's about. He's got to explain why they should care about it. He's not talking about the stuff they already come into the debate caring about.
So, Matt, maybe that gets us to the issue of who's going to win in November, since he didn't really, Trump didn't pander to the Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and those battle states. Is he destined to lose? The election voting odds increased dramatically to 60% this morning on election betting odds. Do you see any chance that the the secret ballot is going to elect Donald Trump or re-elect Donald Trump?
Are you seriously asking a journalist, let alone a libertarian journalist, to accurately forecast an election?
Yes, it's you're on the spot here.
Listen, the one thing that I'll say, and this kind of touches to the comedy question. Comedy works best when you insult comedy in particular, and Donald Trump is the funniest president maybe that we've had, or at least that Ronald Reagan had some good timing too, but Trump is an insult comic, and he's very, very skilled at it, which his detractors hate to admit. But part of that depends on wrong footing, or my God, I can't believe that he had the cojones to say that in a political context where there's supposed to be this sort of other rules about engagement. And that's thrilling when you're the insurgent, when you're the outsider. It is not thrilling when you know what's coming, when you know that's what he does, when he's the president. That's a challenge he has a hard time running. He has to run against the record of himself, which is a little bit awkward. So this has been an unusually stable race. 90 to 95% of voters made up their mind 6 months ago. They're really, I mean, the number of undecideds, the number of third-party supporters is really vanishingly small. And when you look at their preferences of those people, big poll came out a couple of weeks back. Something like 47% of people who voted third party in 2016 compared to something like 20-something% said that they want to vote for Joe Biden this time around. People are coming back to the two-party fold to vote against the other bad guy. And right now that energy, including for independents, which is double-digit percentage in favor of Biden, and I think third-party voters, is all trending Biden, and that the stability of the race has just been remarkable. It's been nationally between 6.5 and 9 percentage points, basically the last 3 or 4 months. It's hard to see anything, including last night, we've had a pandemic in the meantime. It's not a small thing. That hasn't, if you look at the line of the race, it hasn't moved anything. So what could possibly move that last remaining nub of people who were persuadable to come out? I don't know that there is such a thing. And so absent that thing, it's going to be really hard for Donald Trump to win.
I think all he has to do is promise to nuke California, and he'd win 50 states, because even the Californians would be like, well, it's tough but fair.
Yeah.
So, Kevin, I think one of the things that we on Wall Street really appreciate is gridlock, but the way the betting is now, the Democrats are going to sweep in November. If that happens, where's the economy going? I mean, Chris Wallace, he came up with this crazy statistic that you're going to increase jobs and all kinds of economic growth through these high tax, high spending policies. One thing I did think Joe Biden did bring up that I thought was pretty good, or Chris Wallace did, are we going to have a V-shaped recovery or a K-shaped recovery? I thought that was a really good question, because some people are being left behind. I know my daughter and her son-in-law, my son-in-law, they're both unemployed. They worked on cruise ships. Restaurants are going under. So there is that K going on in the economy. Entertainment is down. Publishing is down. Meanwhile, technology and online and Amazon are going through the roof. Is the economy a K recovery or a V recovery? What's your view?
I think that the really big question is Biden actually going to pursue the policies that he's embraced in order to get the left to support him? And at National Review over the next week or two, we're going to be going into a lot of work that Casey Mulligan at the University of Chicago and I have been doing on this. But there's just so much stuff that they've proposed that is humongously harmful to the economy. And I'll just give you an example, that they're increasing the payroll tax for people above 400,000, or they're exposing all income above 400,000 to the payroll tax, which is a 12 percentage point increase in the tax rate for small businesses that employ more than 40 million people, right? And so it's like one of the most catastrophic proposals that I think anyone's ever seen in terms of the economic harm that would cause immediately, and nobody's even talking about it. And so I think the question is, does he actually pursue that stuff or does he not? And I think that if he does, then there's no telling how bad the economy will get. Casey and I are going to estimate that the reduction in GDP is going to be in the 8 to 10% range once you aggregate all his policies and look at the economic effect.
Wow.
Were you guys all expecting Biden to just collapse? I think partly what happened last night was that everyone expected Biden to just implode. And I think partly why Trump was so angry and sort of off kilter right from the beginning is he went in for the knockout punch right at the beginning. And I think when it didn't happen, and when Biden surprisingly was able to string some sentences together without losing his place, and it only happened once or twice and on some pretty minor stuff, I think Trump didn't really have a backup move which was we got to dance. We got to do this for a couple of rounds. And he just kept going and going and going, and it never came around.
We should have asked Dr. Mercola what kind of pills Joe Biden was taking, the uppers, to keep him doing really well. I agree with you. He did not blunder at all, really.
Well,
I think it's
what do you guys make of that?
I think it's crazy the extent to which the Trump campaign team has spent the last 5 months trying to sell the idea that Biden is a senile, drooling moron. If that's the case, you let Biden make the case that that's true. You let Biden talk uninterrupted and let him show that that's true. You don't lower expectations for him and set the bar so low that he's bound to exceed them in practice. And that's what they've done. I think it's been a real strategic blunder on the part of the Trump people.
And like, if it's going to be about like oral skills, oral presentation, that's going to be kind of a wash, people. I mean, it's not that I think Trump is cognitively sharper than Joe Biden, but like, he doesn't clean up very well. You don't want to invite him home for Thanksgiving. It's like, he doesn't know how to behave, right? Like, there are people I know who exist in the world who said, that's how I think that behavior should be in the real world. There are some, but they're not many. Right. So like, if you're going to make kind of your presentation skills a big thing, I don't know, man. He's just in the same way that, having Donald Trump as your salesman for anti-socialism. How about someone who didn't grow the size of the annual federal budget by nearly $1 trillion in 47 months?
Yeah, it's really kind of funny to have Trump attack, the Green New Deal. It's $4 trillion when he's spending $2 trillion. So $2 trillion is reasonable, but $4 trillion is insane. He doesn't have a lot of credibility there.
Well, Malice, as the guy who gets the trolls more than anybody, maybe except for Trump, were you surprised that he didn't have a backup move, that he didn't have some sort of, I didn't knock him off in this first half hour, I better change tactics at some point?
No, I think I'm not the only one to point out, and I'm sure Kevin has experienced this on a personal level, that Donald Trump is pretty much pure id, and that he only does have very few tactics. We've seen him restrain himself at various times, like during the Kavanaugh hearings, he kind of held his tongue. And there are certain other instances, but I think on a very visceral level, he has that New Yorker's contempt for people that he perceives are weak. So if he's yelling at this man in his face and saying just really scurrilous things, and Biden won't even look at him and it's just kind of laughing it off, I think at a very visceral level, it triggered him to just go harder and harder and harder. It's like, come on, stand up for yourself, because this is someone who, by all accounts, when he would find some blog making fun of The Apprentice, would have meetings and would talk for 15 minutes ranting, like, do you think this is true? And people couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that he cared that some random jerk on the internet had a negative opinion of him. So I think that's what we were seeing there. And in one sense, Biden got the best of him that way.
There was one other thing.
Kevin, his own experience. So you're the only one who's really spent a lot of time with Trump. Although I understand that you were not always in the room, so to speak. That he didn't really like economists. Is this true?
No, that's just not true. No, I'm sure I saw him about as much as anybody in the 2 years that I was there. The thing I could say about and so now I'm not excusing rude behavior, because I hope you've never seen me engage in it. I don't know, maybe I have. Certainly privately to Ramesh, but I think that one of the dynamics that was interesting was that Vice President Biden was saying things that were just patently false. And then Wallace was not saying, well, wait a minute, that's disproven, things like that. And so then Trump was interrupting to say, oh, no, wait a minute, I didn't actually say that. Or, no, that's you're taking it out of context. There were so many of those. Whereas, you got to admit that the moderator was interrupting President Trump and saying, no, wait a minute, that's not true. There's no problem at all with mail-in voting, even though, we actually have convictions that you can actually go, and there's a website where you click on the state and you can see all the mail-in voting convictions. And there's many in many states. Now, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, a national conspiracy to steal an election, but the idea that worrying about fraud and mail-in ballots, given that we've found in New Jersey, the mailbox filled with hundreds of them and so on. It's a reasonable thing. And to have the moderator basically sort of say, oh, no, that's just discredited, that's disproven. That's the kind of night that he was having. And I think that he was getting very frustrated with that. And I think getting frustrated is probably not a good debate tactic, but it is astonishing how many just false things that Vice President Biden said right at the beginning. And then, in terms of the projection that Democrats do, he then turns and calls the president a liar left and right.
Yeah, and very quickly, just want to say, we keep talking about the importance of preserving the integrity of this election, and then as soon as he brings it up, it's like, oh, that's ridiculous. There's no problems. It's like, well, which is it?
Yeah.
Right, or even, the critical race theory question, when Wallace framed it, it was as if critical race theory is anti-racism, but if you've been paying any attention to it, it's actually instilling racism in our institutions. And I think Trump sort of faltered there because he's not the greatest explainer of ideas. And then he got hung up on this white supremacy line. And that seems to be, from what I saw this morning, that seems to be the thing everybody's getting caught up on.
He's also not the greatest haver of ideas, Dave. I think is a problem here. I'm not sure he understands what's happening in the Ibram Kendi universe.
Right, but again, think about this. That we right now, if we were going to think about like what are the top 5 things if you got to interview Joe Biden that you would push him on, then none of those came up. None of them, not one. Right. And then when they did ask him, like, so would you stack the Supreme Court and do away with the filibuster? He refused to answer. He said, oh, I'm not going to talk about that because then everyone's going to talk about that. Or it's about what he said. Right. Exactly. And then Wallace just let it go. He just let it go. I mean, talk about being in the tank for somebody. I thought it was disgusting. And it's something that we've seen in every Republican debate forever and ever and ever. You just go back and look, at George Stephanopoulos asking about taking away contraception and so on. And so I think that it really is a problem in the debates. And I think it's one reason why Trump has sort of burst through with his super aggressive behavior, because people recognize that the moderators are in the tank for the Democrats.
To defend Chris Wallace for a second, I dispute that he's in the tank. I think he did a lousy job last night. I think that pretty much everybody would have done a lousy job last night who isn't intimately familiar with worldwide wrestling or something. But I don't think that he's in the tank. I think he's a serious journalist who had a bad night.
He had a bad night. Okay, so why was he just so deferential to Biden and not even asking him any hard questions? And then when he got close to a hard question, he just dropped it.
Biden cannot be allowed to get away with this excuse that it's a distraction before the election to talk about his plans for after the election. That's what an election is supposed to be about. And that excuse on court packing works for any inconvenient issue that any candidate doesn't want to talk about. It is just the most transparent thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably the perfect segue for our next guest, who is that third party. There is this third party still in America, that Libertarian Party. So we're going to jump to Joe Jorgensen. But thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Take care.
All right, so let's throw to Libertarian presidential candidate Joe Jorgensen.
I got the love of our country from my grandmother. She instilled in me the American values and explained how great it was, and she knew how great America was because she was an immigrant. She explained that in the old country, it didn't matter how hard you worked. It didn't matter if you worked a second or third job because the government took everything extra away from you because the government wanted everybody to have the same. Now, listening to her, she sounds like maybe she was from the Soviet Union or an Eastern Bloc country. Actually, she was from Denmark. And unfortunately, we're moving more towards Denmark every day. It was my grandmother's vision of liberty and the basic principles of the Libertarian Party that bring me here today. Everywhere I go, people tell me their stories. And you know what I hear? The old way just isn't working. As your president, I will get government out of the way so my grandmother's vision of the American dream can be a reality for all of us. Last night, In the first presidential debate, Americans got to hear from only 2 of the candidates who will be on the ballot this November, even though there's a third person who's on the ballot in all 50 states. I'm here to present not just a different vision, but a better vision of what America can and should be. The vision of freedom that drew my grandmother to our great country. When I first joined the Libertarian Party movement 40 years ago, I would explain to people that, the Libertarian Party takes the best of the right and the left. We take the economic freedoms from the people on the right, and we take the social liberties, the social freedoms from the people on the left. But I can't say that anymore because I don't even hear about economic freedoms from the people on the right, and we certainly didn't hear any last night, and we haven't seen that in the last 4 years. We didn't hear any good plans in the debate last night when it came to health care, despite having over 4 years to come up with a plan and repeatedly promising to do so. President Trump has no explanation of how he would replace Obamacare. Meanwhile, Vice President Biden is planning to double down on that program, which has failed so many. I say it's time for a new way. As I see it, the problem with our health care is that our insurance isn't actually insurance at all. In any other industry, insurance only pays for unexpected costs, and because of that, costs remain relatively low. Meanwhile, our healthcare insurance system pays for everything. Just think of how expensive your car insurance would be if it paid for gas, oil changes, or car washes. First of all, you would have absolutely no reason to shop around for the best gas prices because you'd simply take out your little $5 copay card. In fact, you may even go to the nicest gas station where they give you free coffee while you wait. And of course, the gas stations would have no reason to compete with each other because they could raise prices without you even knowing it. Why? They would simply raise them to the insurance company, and the insurance company would simply increase your premiums next year. This is exactly what's happened to the healthcare system. There is no reason for patients to shop around for better prices, and so consequently, there's no reason for healthcare providers to compete on price. Meanwhile, insurance companies keep increasing prices without any accountability at all, and we're the ones left footing the bill. We have 2 examples we can draw from where something similar to a free market system works, both in Singapore and the state of Indiana. In both systems, people pay for healthcare out of their own pockets of everyday costs, and they leave the catastrophic care only to the healthcare insurance. I remember Donald Trump saying decades ago that when it came to getting woman rink done, what he did was he went and looked to see where they had done it successfully. So he went to the Canadians and asked them, hey, how do you get a skating rink done? And he got it done. So why doesn't he do the same thing for health insurance? All we have to do is look to Singapore and see a successful system. So why doesn't he go there and follow their system? And by the way, they use insurance for catastrophic costs only. Their costs are only a third of what they are here, and doctor visits only cost $10 each, which is less than our copay. And by the way, the state of Indiana has a similar system. We've got an example out there. Why doesn't Donald Trump use it? If I were president, I would go with what works. I would go with success and recreate it for our country. When it comes to COVID-19, again, neither candidate was able to articulate a real policy. President Trump's FDA has stood in the way of expanding testing. South Korea confirmed its first coronavirus case within a day of our first case and quickly jumped ahead in testing, containing the spread without a lockdown. Meanwhile, the first company to create tests in the U.S. that could be conducted outside of hospitals was stopped when the FDA said they needed quote-unquote, further assessment. When I am your president, I will get rid of the efficacy requirement of the FDA, if not the FDA entirely. On the other hand, Vice President Biden's solution is to institute national mandates. In a pandemic like this, it is best for communities and families, not the federal government, to be making decisions on their health. Both the Democrats and the Republicans send the message that if the government doesn't do it, then it won't get done. That's why they're telling us that we need to wear masks. However, Walmart and other stores have proven them wrong. Walmart came out and said if anybody comes to our store, they need to wear a mask, and other stores followed suit. Rather than having a one-size-fits-all from the government like Biden and Trump want, how about having each person decide every day, each day allow us to vote with our feet or vote with our dollars? If we want to wear a mask, we go to the stores that have masks, such as Walmart and the other stores. If we don't want to wear a mask, let us vote with our feet, vote with our dollars for the other stores. On the economy, both candidates offered more of the same. It is individuals in the private sector working together, innovating and creating, who create booming economies. Government needs to just get out of the way. In fact, the same money in private hands creates twice as many jobs as in the government hands. The president did, however, make an important point about the tax code. He pointed out that the tax system is so complicated that only the wealthy and connected, such as himself, can navigate the codes with fancy tax accountants. Vice President Biden's solution is simply to raise taxes, which will ultimately be paid by hardworking American families. I propose something different. I will eliminate the IRS and work with Congress towards eliminating the federal income tax altogether. I want every American to pay as little in taxes as President Trump did. Vice President Biden, meanwhile, attempted to promote economic protectionism through tariffs and invoking the mantra of Buy American. Unfortunately, this is following in the footsteps of President Trump. I'm so sad to be the only free trade candidate in this election, but I'm very proud to be a free trade candidate. Trade boosts the prosperity of both the United States and our world neighbors. Because of specialization across nations, countries exchange not just final products, but intermediate products that create goods. The expansion of trade over the last 70 years has resulted in an average of $18,000 towards each American family, benefiting those who are the poorest the best. As president, I will dismantle all tariffs and any other trade barriers which prevent the flow of goods and services in and out of the country. Americans deserve the best, and it doesn't matter where the best may come. On the issue of climate change, Vice President Biden meanwhile proposed a top-down government mandate, including a stop to new coal or oil factories. I propose something different to address this important issue. I will work with Congress to end all energy subsidies and level the playing field. Additionally, we must reduce barriers which entrench existing sources, such as fossil fuels, to prevent competition and innovation, which can help create cleaner energy. The most promising form of energy is nuclear, with a carbon footprint vastly outmatched by its efficiency. Ironically, the candidates were also asked to comment on the integrity of this election. In any other country, we view with disdain the censoring of political opponents, but it has become accepted practice here. Why was I denied the opportunity to speak to millions of Americans? I think I know why. Because I would give the only choice, the only alternative to big government. I see America through my grandmother's eyes, a place where the rights of the individual are greater than the power of government, a place where liberty means minimum government and maximum freedom, a place where the American dream isn't a dream at all, it's real and it's right there in front of you because you made it happen. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, friends of FreedomFest and the Dave Rubin Show, we welcome you back to another great session of our emergency meeting here at FreedomFest, co-host here with Dave Rubin. And this session is on American education and the importance of the cultural changes that we're seeing as a result of the events of 2020. And we have with us three great experts. We have Corey DeAngelis, who's the Director of Public Choice at Reason Foundation, and I understand has been nominated. You may not even know this, Corey, but you've been nominated for the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. So that would be really cool if you made something like that. We also have Kerry McDonald, who is the Senior Education Fellow at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. I was president of FEE back in 2001, 2002. Kerry, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. And then last but not least, Connor Boyack, who runs the Libertas Foundation in Utah, the only real libertarian think tank in Utah, and is making great progress there, and the author of the Turtle Twins, right? The Turtle Twins, I think is the.
Oh, you had it right. Tuttle Twins. Yep.
Oh, Tuttle Twins. Okay, the Tuttle Twins. Maybe I was reading that wrong, but it's just great to have you all with us. And so, Dave, do you want to ask the first question? Do you want to get the ball rolling?
Well, let's do a little segue from our previous segment, which was about the debate last night. One of the thoughts that kept popping up in my mind is that we have a real education problem here. It seems like the issues that we're talking about, many of them are either framed wrong or discussed in a completely backwards way, because we don't even know what we're talking about. So let's just do sort of education 101 here. What is wrong with the system right now? Something is deeply wrong. Corey, we've talked about it a little bit on the Twitter machine before, so I'll go to you first.
Yeah, well, traditional public schools have a geographic monopoly because of residential assignment in K through 12 level in the United States, and they have additional monopoly power through compulsory property tax funding. And so I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with problems with the school reopening debate right now. You look at the private businesses, private schools, private daycares, private grocery stores, they're all either reopened already or they're fighting to reopen, whereas you have far too many public schools fighting to remain closed right now, or they're just not reopening for business for their customers. And I think the main difference here is one of incentives. One of these sectors gets your money regardless of how well they meet the needs of their customers.
Yeah, that kind of gets to the heart of it, and then it seems like half of our politicians don't want school choice at all. So we've got several problems there. Kerry, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with Corey. I would also say that parents are really not empowered when it comes to education. And I think if there's one good thing that's come out of the pandemic, it's been to put parents back in charge of their children's education, to give them an opportunity perhaps that they haven't had before, to look under the lid of what's going on in their children's schools, and now to demand more options, more choice. EdChoice last year did a survey of parents, finding that while more than 80% of children in the US attend an assigned district school, fewer than 30% of their parents prefer them there. So there's a massive choice gap in American education that I think has an opportunity to be closed now.
So Kerry, one follow-up question. Homeschooling, is homeschooling now in a major bull market, and it's kind of like the public sector blew this opportunity because homeschooling has now become a popular thing?
Yes, homeschooling has skyrocketed over the past several months. Of course, last March, when schools in the U.S. Shut down in the wake of the pandemic and the lockdowns, more than 50 million U.S. students found themselves learning at home, sort of coercive homeschooling or pandemic homeschooling. But what we found just in a recent Gallup poll a few weeks ago was that the rate of independent homeschooling, parents choosing to pull their children out of school for independent homeschooling, has more than doubled since last year. So parents really are taking charge, realizing that they have much more freedom and flexibility and autonomy with independent homeschooling, forming pandemic pods and micro schools with other families, and pursuing different kinds of creative education options that I think not only will get parents through this difficult time in the pandemic, but will really stay with us post-pandemic as well.
Yeah, Connor, do you view this as a silver lining to the pandemic, that people are rethinking these things? I mean, I have people in my family that are at least thinking about homeschooling for the first time, where if you would have asked them a year ago, no, you homeschooling, like that's not for us.
100%. You know, I saw a funny meme about how people perceived homeschooling moms before COVID right? And it was like, what was it? It was, they were kind of pioneer women and these kind of backwater ladies, and how they perceive homeschool women now. And they're like Wonder Woman and all these like amazing people. We have about 250,000 families in our Tuttle Twins community who are reading these books. And so we've done a lot of polling within that community to say, were you homeschooling? Are you now? What of these decisions that you've made, what have influenced them? What's been really interesting, the data that we've gotten back from this research that we've done, is that for a lot of these families, the decision homeschooling was nothing that is new. It was nothing spontaneous. There has been this latent, nascent disinterest, disgust, displeasure with what they have been having their children served in public schooling, where COVID really was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back and led them to finally, poop or get off the pot kind of thing. It's time to make a decision. It's time to finally do what's right by my children. I've been feeling this for a while. Yeah, we can watch the debate and see the byproduct of these elected officials and how substandard that is. But when you go watch those man on the street videos of like high school students or college students, they can't even answer basic civic questions. If the product of our public school system is itself substandard, I think what we're seeing now is a lot of families reconsidering and being kind of pushed into making a decision as to what's more optimal for their child. And in so many cases, that is something like homeschooling.
Why do you guys think that go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to say that just because you go to an upper level college, I mean, after all, President Trump went to the Wharton School, and his vocabulary is not particularly reflective of upper level education. Private schools in particular, I'm really worried about private schools. I mean, I teach at Chapman University in California, and they're losing millions of dollars, and many private schools are going to go under. So there's no silver lining there. Does anybody want to comment? Corey, perhaps, who would like to comment about the private schools? And that's a big negative, if you ask me.
I mean, a lot of people are also enrolling in private schools too, because they're seeing that the public schools aren't even opening. As I said at the beginning, the private schools are fighting to reopen, even though in some places the government is trying to prevent the private schools from opening their doors, which really protects the public school from their competition. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of differences. Some private schools are losing students, some private schools are seeing more. But I think the main way to fix all these problems is to have the funding follow the child. We wouldn't have a whole national debate about school reopenings if we already had school choice through education savings accounts or private school vouchers, because then if your school district didn't reopen in person, you could take your money to a private school. And that's how it should have always been structured. And I think more and more people are seeing this, and they're leaving the public school system, and they're wondering why their money isn't following them to their household, their pandemic pods, or a private school. And the latest polling on this from Real Clear Education actually found that support for private school choice initiatives has actually gone up by 10 percentage points among families who had children in public schools, from 67% to 77%. So families are really re-envisioning how school finance should look. And I think that's another silver lining of this pandemic, that families have always gotten the short end of the stick when it comes to K through 12 education. It's just becoming clear now more than ever. And the solution there is fund the child, not the system. Fund the child, not the institution. We do this with so many other taxpayer-funded initiatives, right? With food stamps, the money doesn't go to a residentially assigned government grocery store, regardless of your choice. With Pell Grants at the higher education level, the funding goes to the student, and the student has a choice in the matter whether to take that to a public or private university. We should do the exact same thing when it comes to K through 12 education. I think this is making sense to more and more people.
So, Kerry, I suspect you agree with Corey's premise there. Do you think this is just a messaging issue? I mean, this one, to me, this is like the Republicans have such a huge opportunity here, because you've got people on the left like Elizabeth Warren who are demanding that everyone go to public school and just throw more money at public schools, while, of course, her own children don't go to public schools or didn't go to public schools. It seems like there's such an opportunity for conservatives, Republicans, libertarians to say choice is good, charter schools good, credits, all of these things. They don't seem to be jumping on it in a sort of functional way.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dave. I think, parents that I've talked to, and I'm in liberal Cambridge, Massachusetts, typically thought of things like school choice or vouchers or education savings accounts as conservative or libertarian, political mechanisms. And I think through the pandemic, they're realizing, particularly as these pandemic pods have been proliferating, that, this is a way of making education options more accessible to more families. There shouldn't be anything political about it. I think it's just makes sense that we have many more choices for more families. And so this is starting to catch on, and I think it will be great to see where this goes. I think President Trump has been right to be reinforcing school choice in many of his speeches. Of course, school choice, any kind of education policy should be at the state and local level. There is no constitutional role for the federal government in education.
And just to jump in there,
about cultural change. Are we seeing a permanent cultural change? Are children, private or public schools, little children, everybody has to wear a mask, everybody age in social distance. Are we brainwashing our children fear? What are we teaching our young people? Online education, it's inferior. There's no question about it. Online education is inferior. I teach on a college level, and I can tell you I dread the online experience I have to go through again in January. Or if it's in person, I not only have to wear a mask, but I have to have a shield as a teacher. And all the students, I can't see how they smile. I can't see, the interaction is lost there. What kind of cultural changes are we seeing from what's happening in 2020?
Let me jump in if I can take that one. That was actually a specific question that we asked our community, trying to understand how much the mask and the current circumstances of schooling led to the decision of all of these parents to exit the public school system. We wanted to tease that out and understand that. What was very interesting is that while I think it was about 2/3 of families said that the mask mandates were part of their decision to leave the public school system, they continually responded yes to every other question. I'm dissatisfied with the curriculum. I don't like how much they waste time. I don't like that my kids are bullied. I don't like that they come home depressed. My child is changing. These are deep dissatisfactions with the system itself, of which the mask is only maybe kind of the tip of the spear, or what is finally causing them to make some of these decisions more recently. I do think that there are going to be long-standing social implications to the way schools are being set up right now with the mask. Just think of the kind of enculturation of having children follow orders that they don't understand, restricting their freedom, the implications of that on things that have nothing to do with COVID, nothing to do with masks. We are basically breeding a generation of submissive people that are going to be pliable to who knows what down the road. And so that's why, every time I see on social media some video of some kid resisting or, causing trouble, I think, yes, finally, there's our next Ron Paul or something like that, someone who can push back and offer an alternative point of view, because I do think we're going to have some longstanding ripple effects of what we're seeing now. I'm hopeful, though, that there is kind of the remnant. There's a contingent of people out there who are saying, I am dissatisfied with what I see. I'm going to do something else. Corey's exactly right. We have to figure out the funding issue, because of all these families that we talk to that decide to go homeschool or private school or pandemic pod or whatever else, the funding is like the biggest problem. And so many more people would unshackle themselves from the status quo if only they had the ability to make it financially work with, having to work 2 jobs, single mom, whatever. It is one of the biggest problems that if we can figure out, there are going to be huge implications for so many more people leaving the public school system. And I think that's for the better.
And by the way, Connor, what you're talking about there is not just at the idea level. I was Zooming with or FaceTiming actually with my nephew who just started 6th grade, and I asked him if he's made any new friends, because it's now they're in school with other schools that have all come together, and he said, "Well, we're in masks all day. Nobody really talks to anybody." And that's just the beginning of this thing. It's like you remember what it's like to be in class and to be able to smile around and joke with a friend. And that's how you start forming social bonds. And we're stripping that from them.
Yeah, and it's making homeschooling look better and better, right? I think that's why we're seeing so many homeschool filings go up all across the country. Texas, for example, reported a 288% increase in homeschool filings from the same time last year. I think Connor looked up similar numbers in the largest school district in Utah, about 175% increase. So people are re-envisioning the factory model of schooling itself. They're re-envisioning the funding structure of K through 12 education and how it doesn't make any sense. And then they're also seeing a lot of things that are going on in the classrooms that they don't really like all that much, with the political persuasions of some of the teachers, for example. And this one teacher from a Pennsylvania school district, I think in Philadelphia, was pointing out on Twitter that he was concerned that parents were going to see what he was teaching the children on the virtual Zoom classrooms. And a lot of conservatives pushed back because they didn't like how certain teachers were teaching their children, political issues.
Yeah, I would also add too that entrepreneurs are taking notice of this increased demand of parents for education alternatives, for schooling options, and are really creating some wonderful new startups. For example, there's a company called Schoolhouse that connects certified teachers with families that want to create these micro schools or pods. I talked to an entrepreneur this week who's starting a project-based virtual school and is really excited by that, because a lot of the parents that he's spoken to are just completely dissatisfied with the remote learning that's happening in their school districts. This is going to be a low cost, scalable virtual option. So, I think we're going to see a lot of entrepreneurship and innovation coming out of this pandemic as well.
If I could play the devil's advocate a little bit, one of the things that we're doing in our country is splintering our educational system. It used to be that almost everybody went to a public school. There were a few exceptions. I went to a public school when I grew up. I don't think I was particularly hurt by the education. My daughter went from a private school in Florida to a public school in New York and actually had a better education, she said. So I think a lot of it depends on the kind of education you get. And yes, I'm going to use a term, Common Core, which is a term that you probably don't like. But there used to be a time when everybody learned more or less the same thing in American education, American history, American science, and so forth. Are we getting to the point where everybody's going their own way and we have no common values, common culture that everybody can say, oh, we're an American? Is that a problem?
Mark, I think we are seeing the manifestation of the late John Taylor Gatto's book, Dumbing Us Down. The system itself has been co-opted. Yes, in yesteryear, you could have kind of run-of-the-mill, solid education, broad-based, critical thinking, logic, and all the rest. We don't have that anymore. There definitely is a faction within the public schooling movement who sees themselves as revolutionaries and sees children as clay, and they have co-opted this system for their own purposes. And so, we can pine for a day gone by when things were better, and I agree they were. Back in the day in media, we had CBS, ABC, NBC, right? We just had a few channels. We had actual journalism, or perhaps better journalism. Now we have like all kinds of stuff. We have the Rubin Report. That wouldn't exist back in a day when we only had 3 channels. So, Are
you saying I'm helping or hurting? That was unclear.
Oh, right, yeah. but choice is important. We have decentralization. Everyone can kind of find what works for them. The problem that we run into, and this is maybe where things like this hurt a little bit, is it does encourage tribalism. Everyone rushes to their preferred person, and we have to figure out how I can binge listen to Rubin Report all day long, but still get along with people who are listening to, MSNBC or something. We have to let this not seep into broader social issues, which I think last night's debate is very a good example of that.
Yeah, I find this to be a particularly tough one for libertarians. Kerry, I'll let you jump in, because if we don't want sort of that monolithic federal structure to be telling everybody what to do and every state how to deal with it, and we want to hand it more to the states and more to the local governments, well, then we are going to have that fraying, because realistically, what is going to be taught by radical teachers in San Francisco is probably going to be very different than, say, what's taught in a rural city in Idaho. Kerry.
Right. Yeah. And, I just wrote an article recently for fee.org that talked about, if you don't want a Biden 1619 commission, you should oppose Trump's 1776 commission. The same idea that education really should be at the state and local levels, that it should be the least coercive possible. And, back to the earlier point that Mark brings out, I think that there's a lot of promise in diversity and in choice, that if we have sort of forced education, forced patriotism, for example, that's not authentic. That's not going to help us out. So the key really is to make education as decentralized, as parent-driven, and as student-centered as possible.
I have a real quick question on Project 1619. Is that the new way we're going in terms of Common Core instead of 1776 as an education system? And then my second question is, what about Prager University and places like that? Is this the future of libertarian, conservative type of education, that we're now going to get our education from a online source like Prager University? Dennis Prager, I think, is a friend of yours, right, Dave? Is that the future? So where are we going here? What do you think of 1699 Project, and what about Prager University?
Yeah, I'll just point out.
Let's go to.
Yeah, I don't think 1619 is kind of like a Common Core because it's not mandated from the top down, but there are some school districts that have already introduced 1619 Project. I think Buffalo, New York, and Washington, D.C. have introduced it to their curriculum, and maybe a couple of other places. And I want to just say the way to fix this issue is not a top-down mandate from the government. You'll never be able to agree what curriculum is the one best curriculum for every single traditional public school in the nation. The only way that we can fix this issue is to allow families to vote with their feet, to allow for that bottom-up accountability and to account for different regional differences. So school choice is needed when it comes to curriculum issues as well. And look, when it gets to the, kind of the political polarization question from before, we already have about almost 90% of kids in public schools today, yet we already have a politically polarized society today. It could be that the public school system is leading to that political polarization. And in fact, if you look at the private school choice literature, if you look at Dr. Wolf's review of the evidence on this, actually turns out that when people choose their schools, it leads to better civic outcomes like tolerance of others' views. And it could be because those schools are better at teaching logic. So people attack the logic of people's arguments rather than their backgrounds, which leads to a more peaceful and prosperous society.
It's interesting, Mark, you brought up Prager University or PragerU. I mean, technically, of course, it's not an accredited university, but what I've found, I've done 3 of their, 4 or 5 minute videos. And what I found is these videos that get seen by millions and millions of people. I think the first video I did with them, Why I Left the Left, has been seen over 20 million times. It at least is the intro to the right ideas. And then I suppose it's up to Better Places of education to take it from there. But I view those types of smaller bites and the things that we on the YouTube are good at, that's sort of the icebreaker. And then we need the structures that the 3 of you guys are talking about to really get the ideas home so that people can get, the right ideas out there, or to learn the right ideas in the first place.
Dave, this is a very critical point. It's important, I think, that we not see this as an either or thing, public school or homeschool, one better than the other. There's so many kids who, for better or for worse, are going to stay in the public school system because of family situations, financial decisions, what have you. It's critical that we on the right figure out how to provide families with information that they can teach their kids in their home to counteract or supplement what they're getting in public school. This is exactly what we're trying to do with the Tuttle Twins, because so many parents want to be able to provide their family, their kids, something better. It's critical, I think, that we figure out ways to communicate directly to the families, whatever their education situation is.
All right, well, Corey, Connor, and Kerry, you guys should be in a band, the 3 of you. We thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My name is Jorgensen, and I'm the president of Foundation for Economic Education. For the past 75 years, we've been committed to defending the ideas of liberty. Looking around the world, I think you would agree that these ideas are more needed than ever. And young people are excited about our ideas. COVID has created many unexpected challenges, but I have some good news too. In the past year alone, we've reached tens of thousands of students in the classroom and millions online. We do that through videos, webinars, articles, and social media. If you want to find out more, please go to fee.org.
Okay, this is our final FreedomFest emergency edition, emergency session, breakout session, and we are going to be talking about practical solutions for a free America. That seems like the right way to end this 2-hour discussion. We've got a couple great guests. I'm going to start with the one guy who's been on the Rubin Report before, Matt Kibbe. Usually when we talk about freedom, we somehow bring it back to Star Wars. Do you want to give me a Star Wars reference right up top?
Honestly, I feel like the pandemic industrial complex is the new Death Star, and they're exploiting our fears in order to concentrate power. And at some point, Palpatine is going to bring it down on us and destroy everything that's beautiful about America, unless the American people fight back. And I think that the entire government reaction to the pandemic, particularly the lockdowns, and we watch these videos online of moms getting tased at high school football games. I think that the overstep by the government on this subject is potentially the next Tea Party, the next reawakening of people wanting their liberties back and wanting more autonomy over their personal lives, and realizing that our overlords in the health industrial complex, in the pandemic industrial complex, they don't know nearly as much as they claim to.
Kibbe, I knew you could give me a Star Wars reference and a well thought out philosophical point. I thought you might say that there was a great moment last night where Joe Biden said I am the Democratic Party, which really had a little bit of Palpatine, I am the Senate. Mark, can you introduce our other panelists?
I will, but I thought, didn't Joe Biden say I am Darth Vader?
That's the next step.
That's the next step. Once he becomes president, I guess. So our other guests are David Friedman, who is a legal authority and an economist at Santa Clara University in California. He is ensconced in his library, it appears. David, we're glad to have you here. And we have also Magatte Wade, who is from Austin, Texas, and she is with the Atlas Network and is the director of the Center for African Prosperity. So that's a very optimistic title. I like that a lot. And so let me ask a question to David first. David, you're a legal scholar. How can the government get away with abridging our freedom to peaceful assemble, to freedom of religion, freedom of speech? It seems like all of these have been abridged with these executive orders. What authority do they have to legitimately do this?
If you mean legally, I suppose the ultimate answer is the fact that most of the courts will back them. We've had at least one case so far of a judge who, I think in Pennsylvania, found that there was no such authority, and that would depend in detail on the state constitution, I think, since it's almost all of it has been done at the state level, not at the federal level. Beyond that, as far as I can tell, there are sort of very wide and rather vague authorities under the usual legal rules about epidemics and contagion and so forth. We know that isolating a typhoid Mary was considered legal, and I think arguably should have been. And then it's very hard. You know, there aren't a lot of bright lines in the world, unfortunately. And it's, if you imagine for a moment that this disease were about 20 times as bad as it is, you then probably would also be in favor of saying people aren't allowed to get together and spread the disease. And I think as it's turned out, it's pretty clear that the reaction was a considerable overreaction. But I don't think we live in a world in which you can take a constitutional provision as a really sharp, bright line that we're supposed to have the government not be involved in religion, but that really isn't possible. That the government makes decisions. Those decisions are affected by your religious beliefs. If you really believed that certain activities would result in God raining fire and brimstone down on the city, you would think it was appropriate to forbid those activities. But of course, if you don't believing that a religion is false is also a religious belief. So I think if you really look at it, the rules that we would like to think of as really sharp, bright line rules rarely are. And when things look terrible, when there's a war on or a disease, people tend to push pretty far on those fuzzy lines.
David, let me follow up with another question. Should there be any limits to executive power during an emergency? Some states, for example, say after 30 days, the executive order to continue has to receive the approval of the legislature. I believe that's the case in Utah, in Hawaii, not in Nevada, but so it depends on the state. But aren't you shocked by how much power these people have wielded? And what kind of limits can we place upon these emergency powers, even during a quarantine?
I'd have to say I am not shocked. That if you think about things that happened, say, during World War II, when a whole lot of Japanese Americans were locked up, when there was no evidence they committed any crime at all, and actually the arguments for doing it turn out to have been largely bogus. So when people get scared, things happen. You know, that's I think you have to allow for that in the real world, unfortunately. Now, I think it makes sense to say that executive authority only overrides the ordinary rules for a very short term because the legislature can then meet. But I don't think, it's not clear to me the legislature would have made different decisions in most states. I guess the last couple of presidents, I think, have been particularly aggressive about the idea that they want to do things and there doesn't happen to be Congress willing to go along, so they'll do them anyway. And so far, Congress has been mostly unwilling to call them on it.
Yeah.
You know, if you think of most of the overreaction by the executive at the federal level, really is a case of Congress not stopping it. That you know, the Congress, the Constitution is quite clear that the president can't declare war, and yet I think, I'm trying to remember when was the last time that we actually had a real declaration of war? Maybe Korea? I'm not sure.
No, no, World War
not
II.
Even Korea.
Yeah.
So basically, Congress has taken the position, well, we're not declaring war, we're just dropping bombs on people. And the president's allowed, he's the head of the military, after all, he's allowed to drop bombs on people. So, no, anyway, I think what you really want to ask is not what should happen, but what's your best prediction of what will happen. That, in general, I think one of the mistakes with a lot of political argument is that people argue about the ends that they claim to achieve rather than about the means. That somebody says, we want a government that will help the poor. And they don't ask, given the nature of government, will it in fact help the poor? Or will it buy the votes of the poor with money from people who aren't poor, the votes of the middle class with money from the poor and the rich, the votes of the rich with money from the poor and the middle class, and sort of transfer in all directions. So anyway, that would be another long story. But I think I am less optimistic perhaps than you are about the ability of a legal rule like a constitution to actually restrict governments. As you know,
I'd like to, if I can switch now to Magatte and talk to you about freedom and race. I think is a really important issue. We have all kinds of laws on the books now that prohibit discrimination. Have those laws worked, or are we entering a society in the United States, let alone Africa or anywhere else, where racism is getting worse, or do you think it's getting better? And to what extent do we have a free society in terms of pursuit of happiness, pursuit of work, pursuit to live your own life the way you wish, and do it for all Americans? Oh, let's see.
Yes. I think she might be muted.
There you go.
There we go.
Yes. To answer your first question, Mark, I will go ahead and say it the way I feel it. It's, as a Black woman, I believe that there is no better time than to be alive than to 2020. Simple. If anyone wants to go back to any point in life, you know, from the racism standpoint, bring it on. I think this is the best time for any Black person to be alive from that standpoint. Now, if you want to talk about pre-slavery Africa, that's a whole nother thing. But even then, I would not want to have been alive then because of you know, we didn't have all the things we have today. So in any case, from the material standpoint, that's what I mean. So so that's what I want to put out first. And then when it comes to race, racism, freedom, where do we go forward? What's ahead? I am actually very, very optimistic about the future. I feel that this crisis brought in by COVID and the lockdowns, and then even with the disastrous and the death of George Floyd, that's what I'm talking about here, the death of George Floyd. The aftermath of all of that and Black Lives Matter coming to the front, you know, I passionately believe in the ideas of Black Lives, in the three words, Black Lives Matter. Those three words together, passionately as a Black person, believe in what those words mean. But I absolutely have no sympathy with the organization itself and what they stand for. Anywhere from their rejection of, you know, this idea that a child needs a family, you know, to do better in life. And also, quite frankly, I'm quite put off by their Marxist ideas and the anti-capitalist ideas. So the reason why I think there is something interesting here that's been happening, though, is for the longest time, a lot of Black people in America have just been like, yeah, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. Of course. They don't dissociate the organization with what these three words mean. But today, now that it has come so much to the front, everybody started looking more. And do you know how many of my Black friends I have here in America that tell me, you know, I really don't identify with Black Lives Matter, the organization. They're starting to go deeper and they're starting to see these elements. And I am also starting to see friends standing up stronger and more for, no, it is important for a child to be born in a two-parent household. So I'm seeing a lot of conversations that are happening now and a lot of questionings that are happening now that I did not see happen before. And I think those are great questionings. So I'm very optimistic from that standpoint. And another thing has to do with when you look at the equation, the success equation, you know, finish high school first, yet we know that 60% of Black male will not finish high school. Then make sure that you get a job, full-time job next. And then if you're going to have children, try to bring them in a two people's household if you're going to have children. Well, what I'm seeing is that even there, when you look at the education, on the education side, finish high school. Well, a lot of Black people now are finding some type of liberation with the fact that, you know, school doesn't happen directly. People cannot, they close the schools. So now folks have to go over and teach their children from home. It is hard for many people for different reasons, and this is a debate for another day. But what I am seeing here is that a lot of Black parents are actually making finally a distinction. A lot of them are starting to look at what it is that their kids were learning or not learning. So there too, I do think that the free choice movement has amazing, really great days ahead of itself. So talking about freedom, you know, school choice is really going to be big going forward. So I'm very excited about that, and especially as to what it means for this very bad, percentage that we have of Black people supposedly who are not going to finish high school. So I believe that with school choice, more of these Black boys are going to get to finish high school, which is going to work for them in the long term. And last but not least, conversations that I have also seen happen because of this violence and the riots and everything is actually now people being willing to put on the table this conversation that needs to happen, which is what I call Black culture matters, okay? If you want to have, to thrive in a society culture really does matter. Culture does matter. And there are universal traits of character that will allow you to do well, no matter who you are, no matter what skin color you are, no matter what gender you are, no matter who you are. So those conversations are now coming to the table. And as I'm speaking to you, I have a show called, we call it Catch the Drip. So Catch the Drip is basically a show where we invite in the rappers, the hip hop artists, the people who have given the black urban culture a very, very bad name so far. And we're giving them a chance for redemption, where we actually get to talk about the very strong traits of characters that everybody should have if you're going to make it from point A to point B. And the last one is going to be a podcast called Black Culture Matters, where we go deep on these issues. Anyone else would bring up these issues, they would be called racist, anything, we bring it on. And we're going to talk about the need we need to kill the senseless violence that's happening in the Black urban communities. And someone has to talk about it, and we're going there. And these conversations, it's never been a better time to have them than now. So from so many standpoints, life threw lemons at us with COVID and everything that has ensued. But I guarantee you that many Black people are working behind the scene right now, and we're going to make the best lemonade out of this. So I'm very, very optimistic.
All right, a little optimism. That was by far the most optimism that we've gotten in these 2 hours. So I like seeing that silver lining. I want to stick with the race thing for just a minute, because you gave a couple interesting offshoots there that we could jump to. Matt, I'll throw this one to you. But it seems to me that a lot of people seem to think that the government is supposed to solve racism, when in many cases, we've actually gotten racism out of the equation already. But even if you watched the debate last night, Biden actually called Trump racist, and they got into that stuff about critical race theory and 1619 Project and everything else. But what underlies that is somehow that the government is supposed to be the entity that will deal with this sort of innately human problem. Is that just like the complete wrong framing of this?
Well, it's laughable, because if you look at the murder of George Floyd, and I would add the decision that just came down about Breonna Taylor, these are teachable moments about all the things that government abuse of power has wrought on the Black community, starting with the drug war, but starting with, I think there is a disparate outcome when it comes to the enforcement of laws, and a lot of it has to do with the drug war, which itself has very racist roots. So I think it's a teachable moment where a lot of people that are looking for government to solve problems like racism, guess what, guys? They created the problem in the first place. And by the way, they love pitting us against each other. They love dividing us. They love using it as a wedge issue to win the next election. And I think, again, just like the mom getting tased at her son's football game sort of woke up to conservatives about what happens when government goes too far, I think Breonna Taylor is a cautionary lesson about what happens when you give government too much power. They abuse it. They always abuse it. And the only way to take it back is through peaceful grassroots mobilization. The violence actually helps the bad guys.
So I see we have just added Stephen Hicks has joined us. Thank you for coming. And Stephen is with a senior fellow at the Atlas Society. Professor Hicks, since you're in the education field and writing and so forth, we're talking about racism. The narrative now is to teach in all the schools that racism is inherent, that you can't get away from it, that it's never going away. What's been your experience with minority students that you teach? Are we able to have a consensus as all Americans, or are we now divided?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to sign on with Magatte. I'm actually short-term pessimist. I think we have a generational problem. But the roots of it are not primarily political, but I think they are cultural and cognitive. What we have, unfortunately, is a whole generation of people who are underschooled, undereducated, and racism is a defense mechanism for those who adopt it against what they see as a world that is too difficult and too complicated for them to understand. If you're smart, if you know your stuff, if you can rely on your own individual judgment to take on the world, to make your business and family life and so forth a go, then you will be oriented toward independence and self-responsibility. But if you are, by the time you approach adulthood, in your honest self-assessment, aware that the world is difficult, that you don't have good math skills, you don't have good social cultural skills, you don't understand the way the world works. We're living in this very complicated scientific and technological society. It is overwhelming. And I do see not just minority students, but it's broader than that, an increasing number of freshman students who come in and they are not cognitively able to handle the world. So the point then is going to be psychologically, if you don't think you can take on the world independently and make a go of it, and this is the distressing thing for those of us who are fierce in our love of liberty and self-responsibility, to realize how many people then are looking for someone to look after them in some sense. And it doesn't necessarily mean an overtly authoritarian big daddy either in the sky or in government, but they are looking for social networks that they can join in that they think will look after them. So family is a kind of social unit, and people will give up a lot of freedom and autonomy to belong to the family if they have this psychological sense that it's going to look after them. Ethnic groups and racial groups are another easy source for people to latch onto. So I don't think that people are innately racist. I don't think that, I don't know, governments do some disincentivizing things for people in the wrong direction. We do have overt ideological racists who've been doing a lot of indoctrination. But in my judgment, the main issue is a cognitive deficiency that leads people to seek safety in a group, and racial groups are a prominent group in which they can get a sense of identity.
Stephen, I have to say you're echoing my old friend Jordan Peterson, a message that he talked about a lot, which was clean your room first. And we have too many people that think they have to clean the world first and deal with all the world's issues first. But if they could actually just deal with some of their own issues first, that then you can build the world forward, where these days we seem to think that everything should come top down when in effect it should be bottom up.
Yeah, I think that point is orthogonal to the point I'm making, but directly complementary. If you have a certain sense of vacuum in your own life, then another way you can try to think, I'm going to find some meaning in my life instead of putting together a meaningful life for myself, is just put everything out onto the world. I become a world savior, and that gives me a sense of esteem.
So I'd like to ask a question. I'm a sports fan, and I don't know if you love sports. I'm a big NBA basketball fan and college sports and so forth. Well, now every NBA game has a big banner right on the floor that says Black Lives Matter. Am I going to have to suffer through every time I watch a sporting event? Is it going to be political from now on, or can I just sit and enjoy the game?
Do you want any one of us in particular to take that up? You're asking.
I'm just wondering if we have any sports fans. I can't stand to watch the NBA games anymore. Not that I have any problem with race issues and stuff like that. It's just that sports, entertainment, there's a lot of areas. If I go to a concert to hear a rock and roll band, just keep your politics to yourself. I just want to hear the boss sing or Paul McCartney. I don't want to hear political commentary. Is that
Mark? You may note that I have a NBA basketball that was actually used in a practice right above me on the. I don't know if it's fully in the frame here, but I have not watched 1 minute of the NBA this season because I don't like the messaging. But I think the question is actually, let's throw it to Magatte, because you made the point, the difference between Black Lives Matter, the idea that all black people's lives matter, which of course any rational person agrees with, versus the organization Black Lives Matter. And it seems that the NBA is in effect endorsing the organization when they put their messaging on the court.
It seems to me that there are several things happening.
Let's go to Magatte.
Sorry. Yes. No, I think they're making a big mistake. I think, again, I passionately stand behind the meaning of the three words, Black Lives Matter, of course. That being said, if you put your weight behind the organization, I think it's a terrible mistake that they're making. Time will correct that mistake, because this is where actually I love the power of the free markets to solve and correct the situation, and it will correct itself. So I'm not too worried about that. But what I wanted to say real quick is to go back to something that Stephen, you were saying earlier, and Dave, you were talking about Jordan Peterson and his, clean your own room first. I think that maybe the reason why for Jordan Peterson it has resonated with so many people, and I think actually his audience maybe has more white people than not. I don't know, don't quote me on that. But I can tell you that based on my work now with African Americans in this country, I discovered something that has been missing with the message, clean your own room first, and this message of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Where we lose folks in terms of, for this message of self-agency is because really, so many of us have no beginning of an understanding of the threshold at which some folks are starting. When I interview some rappers and they tell you that they were born, and this woman, it could have been me, when she tells you that she was born to two parents and their claim to fame in the neighborhood was that they were the best drug dealers in the neighborhood, and they started selling drugs so that they could make it economically speaking, because that may be the only opportunity they saw. We can sit here and judge those parents all we want, any day, anytime. But now I'm looking at that little girl. Her name is Freedinity, and she's now grown, of course. Her dad committed suicide when she was 5. Her mom started using the doorbell at 7. I think that not enough of us put ourselves in the shoes of someone like that when we try to say, no matter what happened to you, you're responsible for what you do for you. And then I would like for us to add, and we will help you with it, starting where you are. So I think that our message, whether it's Thomas Sowell, Glenn Laurie, all of these folks that I absolutely adore and respect on our side of the spectrum, who say all the things that they say, it just comes across too much as you should, you must, you ought, you have, and blah, blah, blah. Yes, we know the data, we know everything. But can we also start mixing to that what someone like Bishop Omar, based in Dallas, is doing with the OGU movement, his OGU movement, where we're saying, okay, we understand exactly where you're coming from, and we know where you should go. We're going to walk with you. So you come from this environment, we're going to bring with us people who know your background, and we're going to take you to the other side from there. So I do think that our side, with this whole self-agency message, it's a wonderful message, but the reason why it's falling flat on the ears of those who should pay attention to this is because we kind of missed the last mile of bridging to them. And I think that mile is crucial. It's critical. But if we take it, we win. We win because Black people will finally achieve prosperity. And with that prosperity, they're going to get the respect that they deserve. And from there, watch all of this poof, 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 and poof. So that's what I'm seeing.
Magatte, this is me officially inviting you to come on my show to talk about just that so that we can get these ideas out there. How about that?
I know David had a comment, and follow up, David, do laws against discrimination have any unintended consequences?
Obviously they do. If you know that it's hard to fire Blacks, you're going to be reluctant to hire them. That would be the most obvious example. But I think more generally that one of the reasons for racial problems is the shift of more and more activities into the political sphere. That the market is usually a situation where individuals' interests are compatible, where if you are good at doing something and I need somebody who's good at doing that, I want to hire you to do it, you want to be hired to do it. In the political system, you're much more nearly playing in a zero-sum game, where what I want to do is to make up a coalition of people like me in order to make sure that we get more of the pie, which means that you get less of the pie. So I think in that sense, making the world more political has a negative effect in terms of racial and other kinds of group conflicts, because it creates a world where what you want is a coalition that will result in your winning, whereas the market most of the time is not in that situation. But the other thing that struck me about the earlier comment about the Black Lives Matter thing in basketball court is that a bunch of different things are happening at once, which is usually the case in the world. One of them is a fundamentalist religion, which you can think of roughly as wokeism, which, like a lot of other fundamentalist religions, results in some people being very, very enthusiastic and being willing to push very hard for what they think is holy and right and so forth. And people who both don't want to fight them and have no very strong views on the subject are naturally inclined to go along. So I think if you look at say, the status of Christianity in much of US history, there were an awful lot of people who, for public purposes, were Christians and said Christian things, didn't actually believe in it, but there were enough people who did believe in it, so it was sensible to pretend to be that. I mean, I was struck by this whole, quite a while back, there was talk about whether Obama was a Muslim, and it was clear he wasn't a Muslim because Muslims have to pray a certain number of times a day, and it would have been pretty obvious. My question is he a Christian? I know he said he's a Christian. It could be he's a Christian. But given the political environment, it was in the interest of almost any politician to claim to agree with the majority religion because he didn't want to lose voters. I don't know whether any, I would say of the last bunch of presidents, probably a majority of them, I have no way of knowing if they actually believed in the religion they claimed to believe in. So I think it's worth thinking about the world in those terms and how people act. And I suspect that at the moment, if you don't go along with the more or less woke sort of shibboleths, as it were, it's costly to you. You'll get people protesting against you and such. If you do, it doesn't cost you anything. My guess is that, like other fundamentalist religions, the furor will die down, but unfortunately it may take a while because these things, if you think about Islam, I would say it lasted for 50 or 100 years, during which people were really enthusiastic about it and then started sliding downhill with occasional revivals at various points. And I think that's been true historically of Christianity as well, that the number of people who really believe in any religion is not nearly as high as it appears to be, but the number of people who sort of, well, I suppose I believe in it. And I think that's going to be true of wokeism as well. And to what extent pushing too hard is going to cause a reaction, I'm not quite sure, because you've certainly had noticeable amount of people objecting to various things happening associated with sort of generally progressive ideology seen as a religion. But anyway,
perhaps by divine intervention, we ran out of time just as we introduced religion into the equation. I don't know how that worked, but here we are. Thank you guys for joining us on this panel, and I think people will hopefully feel a little more hopeful.
Thank you.
All right, a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, so that is our Freedom Fest emergency session. Mark, I've thoroughly enjoyed co-hosting this with you. I have a feeling that my audience absolutely enjoyed it. So much of what we talked about, these are the core issues that I've been talking about on this show for the last couple of years. And, for the minor points of disagreement that we heard throughout this, because they really were only minor, the broader point is that every single person that we talked to over the last couple hours wants us to live in a more free society. And if we can just keep pushing those ideas, as you guys do with Freedom Fest, then I think we'll have done our part in this crazy world that we live in.
Dave, you're so right. And it has been a real pleasure working with you for the first time. And we are of common mind in our goal for a free society, an open society. Right now, we're living in a very dangerous time period because everything is closing up. I mean, it's hard to travel. It's hard to meet with people. It's hard to go to school on a normal basis. The political situation is divisive and disagreeable, to say the least. There are a lot of problems that we face. One of the reasons I started Freedom Fest back in 2007, this is going to be our 14th year coming up, is because I sensed that we had lost something in our society and we needed to get it back. And so I hope all of you will join with us for next year's Freedom Fest event. It's going to be a really fun time, and we're going to definitely meet in person. That is our goal. We're not going to let this happen to us again, where we're shut down by the imperial authorities. If you would like to support us more, there is a donate button at the bottom here of our announcement of our emergency session, and I hope you'll take the opportunity to donate to a good cause. And I thank you all for participating in our emergency meeting. And if you like what we're doing, we'll probably do it again. But our key is to gather together as free people. That is our goal. And we know as a result of that, good things will come about it. We've had many letters from people saying that FreedomFest was the best conference they've ever attended. So I hope you'll be part of it. And we look forward to giving you some updates from time to time about our program next year. Healthy, wealthy, and wise is our theme. And I think it's an important one that you all want to be a part of. John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods Market, and Steve Forbes, our co-ambassador, they will both be there, as long as some real headliners, along with Dave Rubin and others. It's really going to be an exciting time. So until then, thank you all, and may you live free and happy and safe lives. Thank you.